My name's Rob Walsh, and I'm the director of educational programs. I'm new to the school. I started in January this year. Prior to that, I was in Japan. I worked for the University of Maryland, their global campus, and I taught communication and writing and English as a foreign language. And so this is a big change for me to become an administrator. I was an administrator in a previous life. Many years ago, I was the director of student life at a small college in South Carolina. And I wrote a paper in 2014 and presented it at the eLearn World Conference on e-learning in New Orleans. And the original title of the paper was, as you can see, Organizational Prerogatives. Pardon me, I cut and paste the wrong topic there. It was Organizational Prerogatives of Tribal Colleges of the Upper Midwest. And so I kind of mixed and matched my two titles there, so you have to forgive me. But I wanted to give you the highlights of that original paper. So just a quick overview of the paper would go something like this, that it was an acknowledgement of tribal colleges within the United States within the historical perseverance of what I called in the paper a scientific racism, going beyond a systemic racism, of the purposeful racism and the purposeful elimination of peoples, and also the leadership at tribal colleges and universities, and the navigation that must take place between two contextual dichotomies that exist outside the boundaries of the tribal colleges and, of course, inside the boundaries. So in overviewing dual mandates that occur, for example, the recovery and the maintenance of cultures and traditions, and then to educate Native American students for an expectant future. The other navigation is the traditional higher education in the United States has low knowledge, generally speaking, low knowledge about tribal colleges. I heard earlier our conversations about that, or in presentations, for example, in HLC, which we are in the middle of now. And I didn't say earlier, but one of my jobs at Sisseton Wahpeton College is to develop two education degrees. My Ph.D. is in education, and we are learning about what you already know, that HLC sometimes lacks understanding about the culture, as I do too. Let me continue by saying how humbled I am to speak about this topic to people who live the culture, and for myself, someone who's looking in on the culture despite my close proximity. And so if I were to say one more thing, and thinking about what I might have said earlier, is that when I was writing this paper before, I was quite literally looking into the culture. I was friends with Native Americans who were in the cohort in the doctoral program I did at North Dakota State. But now I'm inside that culture and looking out. So I've perhaps gained some perspective. Then back to my highlights, the leadership navigation, and perhaps one of the major navigation elements is the prevailing myths about Native Americans in the what you might call the dominant culture. Then also in the paper is ideas about accreditation, the high expectations placed on tribal colleges, and one might ask embedded questions about why that might be, that there's such high expectations for the tribal colleges. And then maybe that might be the downside, perhaps, on the accreditation process, but maybe the upside is the opportunity to facilitate Native Americans teaching Native Americans. You know, my goal for my position is I won't be needed anymore, and I move on to do something else. And then also in the paper, the success rates of Native Americans in traditional colleges. Just one more look at that in case questions prevail. Then within the paper, just very quickly, I cited Lowe, and of course, this is quite a long time ago by now. When I wrote the paper, this was little less than 10 years old, and now we're in 2021. And so we might look at this with a little bit of relativism. So what are recommendations that could be made outside of outside of tribal colleges for students who are moving into, say, for example, matriculating from a school like Sisseton Wahpeton College, where right now what we have is AA degrees, and students who are wanting to get a bachelor's degree. Of course, we're trying to change that now. We have in the works 4 bachelor's degree programs at Sisseton Wahpeton College. I've mentioned 2 of them, education degrees, early childhood education and elementary education. Those are the work that I'm doing there, and then also a human services degree and a business degree. And so I maybe have somewhat of a unique experience. I worked at Valley City State University, which many of you in the upper Midwest will know. And I worked with Kankdeska Chikana, I'm sorry about the pronunciation, community college, used to be called Little Hoop, in North Dakota, to create opportunities for students to matriculate from that 2-year school to Valley City State University. And these recommendations at that time, when I was working there, were, I found, quite accurate. But the irony is that there's maybe perhaps a historical precedent that Native Americans, and we might say just about anybody that we encounter as in the dominant culture, to adjust to the hegemony of the United States. And I even saw that working at University of Maryland. My context there was to teach people in the military to get bachelor's degrees and master's degrees. And even in that context, it was quite interesting to watch the hegemony that we impose on even a host nation. It's quite ironic. So my point being that the hegemony is very deeply ingrained. And so perhaps to bring it around to my point is that Valley City State struggled to create environments in which Native Americans could survive. I hate to use the word survive. I would prefer to use the word thrive, but that wasn't the case. And so here are some of the recommendations that showed up in the research that I did, is as you can see, to involve Native American students from the start of their education, and not to make necessarily a special dispensation, but to assist them with what is often known as the hidden curriculum. And many of you will know exactly what I mean by that, is that someone looking into a new culture is not immediately able to see what are the unwritten rules of a society. And even with my working at the college at Sisseton Wahpeton College, I'm learning about the hidden curriculum, and it's very fascinating. And it's not different from my adjusting to, say, for example, other places where I've lived in the world. You already know Japan, but also Korea and Thailand. And so this idea of orienting students to the college or to the university in order to have themselves learn to navigate the hidden curriculum. And students have to feel that they belong. And one of the big challenges, I think, of the dominant schools and colleges and universities is, unfortunately, what we might call an abject ignorance about the Native cultures. Even something like Taoshpe would not be known, but it's alive and well on the tribal colleges and in the Oyate of the Native people. So continuing to provide assistance and to be proactive about it, to avoid generalizations about persons or cultures, to orient yourself to Native models or ways of thinking. And perhaps this was my greatest challenge, was to even get the platform as a professor at Valley City State to be invited into a platform to educate other educators of what it might mean to think through Native models or Native ways of thinking. And then to foster and support the students' Native identity. I apologize, one more screen. Lo made quite a few recommendations, which of course we can herald him for, herald him or her for. So focus on the importance of schoolwork and classes, find ways to identify and nurture Native American students' own strengths, perceive and treat each Native student as able to succeed within the context they find themselves, and then to conduct more research. So what's next then for this project, this paper that I'm doing? This really was more of a perspective paper, the first one, maybe you might call theoretically based or a theoretical framework. And so now that I'm back in the United States and I'm situated more, I have an office and I'm in an environment in which I can function in a more research-based capacity, I do want to pick this research up again. And so what would happen next is a SWOT analysis. More about that in just a little bit. Interviews of tribal leadership, tribal community college and university leadership, meaning perhaps presidents and vice presidents, and even farther down into the administration if it's available. But specifically in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota, and in the mostly Dakota and the Lakota and the Nakota cultures, not to exclude the Chippewa or the Ojibwe. And then perhaps a way showing, a sort of a ethic of way showing, having the experience of at Valley City State University, and what would it mean to create educational alliances that work? Well, first, of course, there has to be articulation agreements. We have to follow follow the rules. And then how do we build collaborations? But how do we build environments in which Native Americans thrive instead of survive in these environments in which they're coming from a 2-year degree, but they want to stay in their contiguous regions, perhaps, and succeed at their colleges. And one of the outcomes of the paper that I can, just out of memory, I'm saying here that I didn't list it here, is that by making these adjustments at our senior institutions in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota, is that the entire campus is improved. The entire learning environment is more inviting to everyone. So we're researchers in this environment, and so we very likely already know what a SWOT is, but it is an acronym for these ideas, looking into a particular context. What are the strengths of that organization or that context? What are the weaknesses? What are the opportunities? And what are the threats? And I wanted to back up now and if I could, and just go to the chat for a moment and open this up a little bit, and to see if you might be willing to share in a more informal way, just what are some of the strengths. I'll put this in here first. What are your conceptions of what are the strengths of the tribal colleges and universities? And I would welcome you to speak that or to write it in the chat. Let's do an informal SWOT as part of my presentation. So Karen, thank you for your, oh, go ahead, jump in, please.
Rob, this is Greg Redhouse at Dene College. I was going to say that, let me see, make sure I can get my mug shot going. All right. Now, one of the things that I think we have a lot to share, or at least what we can contribute, is unique experiences. We're very, in our own region and the school and the culture and our students, we have these experiences that we can accumulate. And I noticed when I went to the University of Arizona, when I got into the higher education program, they were really curious because they had all that literature in higher education. But a lot of that literature was based on mainstream experiences at flagship universities.
Exactly.
And so what they wanted from me, and this is where they found it really juicy. They wanted information from me, like, you taught at a tribal college for 10 years. We want you to provide input and feedback on whether or not these theories, the research that's been developed, does it apply? Is it applicable to tribal colleges and universities? Because we don't know. We're mainstream and flagship, and we know these theories apply to us, but we don't know if it applies to the tribal colleges. So I think we have that to our advantage. I think those unique insights to share.
Yeah, thank you so much, Greg. I if you don't mind, I'll comment on what you said. I apologize for cutting you off a moment ago. So I think what I hear you saying is that there's a great deal of theory out there, but the knowledge of how that theory matches with praxis may be missing. Is that accurate? And that the Native perspective can now inform that, especially through the colleges and tribal colleges and universities. I think that's very, very, very valuable. I also think that in my experience of living overseas in Japan and Korea, as I've said before, is that in the context of hegemony, that someone who is not necessarily part of that, who hasn't taken that on, has had their heart broken by someone who is from the dominant culture, and at some time, going forward, may seek to not risk more. So speaking that willingness to share, I think, is very powerful. Thanks, Greg. What I'm hoping that I'm developing at Sisseton Wahpeton College is a system of 2 education degrees that prepare students. If we have the degree in-house, we're able to provide that bachelor's degree without students leaving the campus. But we also need to be conscious of what and who we're sending our students to. Dominant culture schools, even in the boundaries of the tribe, the Oyate and the contiguous area, or anywhere, right? And so to have that competence, I think, is incredibly important. I really appreciate your comments. I hope you weren't offended by my laughing, because I just thought was so inside of that conversation, especially having been the director of student life at Coker College at one time. One day I was telling, I was lucky. I had a grandfather who was not I went on one side of my family was very racist. I grew up around a bigot. I had to survive that, live through that, and come out of that. One on the other side of the family, my grandfather had a farm that was contiguous to the Yankton reservation. And in talking about that, I couldn't help the emotions welled up, how grateful I was to have a grandfather who could see through what was going on in the world and in the region and so forth. And the point I wanted to make is that the pain is on both sides. The pain is, from the dominant culture, is also there, that needs to be worked through. And the healing that needs to be done can be deep healing, but it starts with these type of conversations. Thank you, Greg. I think my time is at the point where if you have a question. Oh, 1 minute to wrap up questions. That's okay. That's good. I appreciate everyone's attentive spirit and willingness to listen to my humble presentation.